Okay, hi guys. Today we're going to talk about how the adiabatic lapse rate refutes climate alarmism and this whole plot to, remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and do solar radiation management, which means blocking the sun from being able to reach the Earth with a giant space umbrella. Um, with this greenhouse effect idea, you'll find that there's a whole bunch of different arguments for it. It starts in with one argument, the back radiation argument, and then it goes through, as you debunk them, they change the argument and the scheme for how it works. But the way that you get around that is to simply look at the physics of the situation and the temperature lapse rate and the adiabatic effect. So let's do that. So the adiabatic lapse rate refutes climate alarmism. Okay, so remember the illogical sequence or the logical sequence of illogic by which they create the greenhouse effect. So remember they start with solar input being equal to 1/4 of itself. So, and that's obviously an incomplete, inconsistent statement, according to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, right? So the solar input is equal to 1/4 of the solar input. That's really the starting point. And, we've seen quotes from Roy Spencer on record saying that that is the basis of climate science, and that's where the entire field of climate science starts, and nobody in climate science would refute that. That's literally the situation we're at, where they see no problem with such a logical, quote, illogical statement that the solar input is equal to 1/4 of itself. That's what they do to start at the basis of their comprehension, their paradigm of understanding the climate, of how to work out how the climate works in physics. They start right here with a solar input. Where's my cursor? There it is. The solar input being equal to 1/4 of the solar input. Okay, so bonkers, obviously, right? The result of that is that sunshine can only heat anything on Earth to up to minus 18 degrees Celsius. So that means that the sun actually doesn't create the climate at all. And we've seen them agree with that position in peer review, as I recounted in my book, in recent live stream in my book, Planet Wars. They literally do think that the sun does not create the climate. They think that the sun provides no primary heat forcing to the climate at all, because they literally think that the sun can only provide minus 18 C worth of warming, even though you can go outside in summertime, feel the sun. You can see clouds, which can only come from evaporation from sufficient primary forcing. They think that's all the atmosphere doing it to itself through the greenhouse effect. So the greenhouse effect is postulated to create the climate and higher temperatures since the sun, in their view, with the solar input being equal to 1/4 of the solar input, cannot and does not create the climate. So what is this effect, this radiative effect, this greenhouse effect? It's a radiative phenomenon. So they have these diagrams where they're showing you how the physics should work. They're showing these arrows, which are about radiation and back radiation, as they call it. And that's also here as well. Yeah, and just a point of that, look at this value that they use for the incoming solar radiation. It says right there, incoming solar radiation, 342. That's what they say the incoming solar radiation is. But that's because, they have a little curve here, but this is actually still for flat Earth math, just like here. They're getting that 342 from this, doing the solar input is equal to 1/4 of the solar input. Well, if you just use a sphere, look what you get. You get the solar input is equal to 1,370 watts per meter squared, 4 times as much. That's a big difference, right? A big difference. But they really hate looking at the climate as if it exists on a spherical Earth. They just hate doing that. So the end result of this is that the radiative greenhouse effect makes the bottom of the atmosphere warmer, and then the middle and the top. Now that's going to be key, as we will see. So a logical sequence to the radiative greenhouse effect is just a slide repeating what we just did. Solar input equal to 1/4 of itself over the entire Earth's surface. The result of that is that the sun cannot create any climate at all. The sun can only heat things to minus 18 degrees Celsius, which is basically, makes the sun irrelevant to the climate. The greenhouse effect is postulated to create the climate and higher temperatures since the sun does not. The climate greenhouse effect is a radiative phenomenon to do with emission and things like that, infrared radiation. Radiative greenhouse effect makes the bottom of the atmosphere warmer than the middle and top. Okay, great. So the thing about the radiative greenhouse effect is that there's actually a circular argument for how it works. So circular argument for the radiative greenhouse effect. Various but cyclic arguments for how it works. So let's go through this. This has been very well established. This cycle that we're going to see here Anyone who's spent enough time with me will be intimately familiar with how this argument goes. So where does it start? It starts with back radiation causes temperature increase. That's where it starts, okay? You'll always start this debate of understanding what the greenhouse effect is and why it's supposedly so dangerous, and they'll, tell you about back radiation, which is based on these diagrams and this arrow pointing back to the surface and how that arrow from the atmosphere is going to make the surface even warmer. So they say back radiation causes temperature increase. Now, the thing about that is that violates the first law of thermodynamics and the definition of heat flow. Here's the first law of thermodynamics. du equals q plus w equals m times cp times dt. So what does that mean? Q and w is heat and work. There's no work being involved here with the radiation, so you just have q, which stands for heat. So that means that if you want an increase, a positive value for dt, if you want an increase in temperature, then you need heat, right? Okay, so what is heat then? Well, heat is an action, a form of energy which acts from hot to cool. Okay, if you need a positive Q, so that means that you need this term, T hot, being greater than this term, T cool. And then here's the equivalent for plane parallel geometry for radiation. This would be for conduction and diffusion. This would be for radiation. Okay, so you need that T hot term to be bigger than the T cool term in order for this term Q to be positive, right? Instead of negative if it was switched around, right? So you need a positive heat to get a positive change in temperature. Well, the thing is, the atmosphere is always cooler than the surface. And so if the atmosphere is always cooler than the surface, then it's impossible for the atmosphere to send heat to the surface and therefore warm it up. Okay, so you go through that and you prove that, and then they switch. What they do is they're caught out and they realize they have no argument there, so then they switch. And what do they switch to? They switch to argument number 2, which is back radiation doesn't cause temperature increase, it just traps heat and causes slowed cooling. So what they're doing here is they're trying to get around now the first law of thermodynamics and heat definition and the definition of heat with sophistry, right? But the thing is, when they make arguments like that, you simply point out that heat is not something which can be trapped. Heat is not an object, it's not a noun, it's not a substance, it's not a thing, it's an action, it's a verb. Heat is a verb because it's similar to work. And what's work? Work is a verb, right? So heat is not something which can be trapped. You can't contain it, right? And so this argument falls apart as well. There's no such thing as trapping heat and slowed cooling. Just because it causes slowed cooling, that doesn't mean that it's, how does that explain getting to a higher temperature, right? So cooling down a little bit slower does not mean higher temperature. In any case, yeah, there's no such thing as trapping heat. Okay, so then once you go through that argument with them, then they'll switch again, and they will say, now they'll start talking, but and we saw this in that recent Sabine, what's her name, Hassenfelder, something like that, video where she, basically went through these arguments as well, and then got into the spectral absorption thing and starts talking about all these complex terms about spectral absorption, but the thing is, that begs the question. So number 3, spectral absorption of heat by the atmosphere from the surface emission. But that just begs the question, how does that make the surface warmer? What we want is the surface to become warmer because the solar input is only minus 18 degrees Celsius. So if this surface is, emitting energy, and some of that energy is being converted to heat or acting as heat as it's absorbed by the atmosphere and warming the atmosphere, that does not at all explain how that means that the temperature or that the surface temperature would be increasing. So it's just begging the question. He's just talking about a whole lot of complex physics about spectral absorption. That does not at all equate to the surface becoming warmer. That only applies to the atmosphere being heated by the warmer surface. Now that's no problem. There's no problem with a warmer surface heating the cooler atmosphere. That makes sense. But just because you're stating that does not explain how the surface is actually becoming warmer, right? So you go through that argument, and then they switch to number 4 and say, yes, but greenhouse gases re-emit in all directions. So some of that energy goes back to the surface and has to be absorbed there. They'll always say that. It'd be like, it has to be absorbed there. Therefore, it has to be increased temperature. But this is actually just the back radiation argument number 1 again. And they're just saying has to because they really want the cold radiation or the colder atmosphere to be able to heat a warmer surface. And so they'll say that a lot. They'll be like, oh, it has to. The emission from the atmosphere has to be absorbed by the surface. And so you just go back to the argument number one and the definition of the first law of thermodynamics and heat flow, and you say, no, it doesn't have to be. Heat only flows. Heat is what is required to increase temperature, and heat only transfers from hot to cold, so the cold atmosphere cannot act as heat for the warmer surface. And so that's the cycle. That's the cycle that you go through with them, and it just goes on forever and ever and ever that way. Now, here's the thing. Independent of mechanism. So whatever mechanism it is, they all have the same result. So whatever, they have 4 different arguments that they circularly go through, but the thing is they all have the same result. And what is that result? So to get around the radiative greenhouse effect scheme of getting around having to explain itself consistently, right? What's key is that they all give the same result. And what's the result? The increase of the near surface air temperature, meaning creation of a temperature lapse rate, i.e. an effect, that is, an effect which modulates the temperature distribution of the atmosphere, such that the bottom of the atmosphere has to be warmer because of this supposed greenhouse effect, and the middle the average, and the top the coolest, right? So that's the effect that it has to produce. The greenhouse effect, according to them, then has to produce a temperature lapse rate. It has to have an effect on the distribution of temperature as a function of altitude, right? Now, here's the thing. We have this thing in physics and thermodynamics called the adiabatic lapse rate, right? And it's actually fairly easy to derive. You simply state, and here you guys would have saw me derive this in the piecewise, step by step in the live stream recently. But here, if you just combine it all together, you have this equation, and then you compute or you solve for dt dh. So obviously the m's drop out. So here I've included the latent heat release, given the concentration, the mass concentration of water vapor in the atmosphere. And so you come to this result, minus 6.24 Kelvin per kilometer, and the measured rate is minus 6.5. And as we discussed in the recent live stream, there's lots of good reasons for why the measured rate should be slightly higher than the theoretical. So it's all pretty much dead on, as you would expect. And so the adiabatic physics calculation totally determines what is the measured temperature lapse rate distribution of the atmosphere. Okay, so you can totally derive it with adiabatic physics. Okay, and what does that mean? That just means that gravity has an effect on a compressible gas on a planetary surface, such that the bottom of the atmosphere has to be the warmest part, and then it has to decrease from there, and then obviously then the average has to be around somewhere around the average of the atmosphere, right? And so the adiabatic lapse rate totally determines what is the measured temperature lapse rate, which is about minus 6.5 Kelvin per kilometer. Okay, so the question is, what creates the lapse rate? Is it the radiative greenhouse effect which creates the lapse rate, or is it the adiabatic effect which creates the lapse rate? So the radiative greenhouse theory claims that it creates the lapse rate entirely, because they never discuss the lapse rate at all. Right, the adiabatic physics, that is. They never discuss the adiabatic physics, which leads to a temperature lapse rate at all. They just say that it's all entirely from this greenhouse effect idea, right? And of course, as we saw, it requires this circular argument. It's based on flawed initial and supporting premises, literally flat earth theory, cold sun, all that. And here's key, there's no demonstration of it arriving at the empirically measured or any value. Like, you can't convert this to physics using known empirical values and get to what the lapse rate actually is. But you can do that with the adiabatic approach. With the adiabatic physics approach, which is first principles thermodynamics in physics, you arrive directly to the empirically measured value of the temperature lapse rate. So what does that mean? That means that there's no room for an additional radiative greenhouse effect modulation to fit in. There's no sign of any additional effect on the lapse rate, on the temperature lapse rate, that could be from a greenhouse effect or anything else, because it's all explained with adiabatic physics. So what does that mean? They cannot both be correct. So which is true? They're creating a simulacrum, right? They're trying to put in this radiative greenhouse effect idea for creating the temperature lapse rate, when we already know that the adiabatic physics already explains fully the lapse rate. Right, and so obviously that's why in such diagrams like this, they never talk about the adiabatic physics. They leave it out entirely, and they want to create the simulacrum where it's all this radiative greenhouse effect instead, right? So they cannot both be correct. One actually leads to the correct measured values. And so, what does that tell you? Obviously, the radiative greenness effect is debunked, notwithstanding that, you should know that in theory already because of where it's derived from, flat earth theory and cold sunshine and all that. Yeah, so here's a little comparison. I'll link this diagram so that you guys can look at it. And yeah, it's a bit complex. I'm trying to simplify this as much as possible. It has been pointed out to me that perhaps this is too complex for most people, and that's probably definitely true. But on the other hand, here's a summary: spherical Earth versus flat Earth. It kind of makes a point. So they're literally doing flat Earth and climate science. I am suggesting that we do spherical Earth. I wanted to throw this in here. I'm going to talk about this, I think, in my next video again in more detail. We've discussed this in the previous few videos now. The point being, and at the beginning we did here too, the point being that we should use a spherical Earth, shouldn't we, for understanding the climate? It makes a difference in the physics. Now, that's what I'm pointing out here, right? I'm pointing out that you can do an energy budget. You can understand how the climate works simply using a spherical Earth and solar input. They really, 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 as we have seen in previous videos, want to use this flat line model where the solar input is equal to 1/4 of the solar input. They really want to do that. And then look at a few of the differences it makes. So if you use a spherical model, then your sun is hot and where it should be at, the distance between the Earth and the sun. For them, their sun ends up being cold. Solar input is equal to 1/4 of the solar input. So the solar strength of sunshine is 1/4 of its strength. It's such an illogical statement. And so, yeah, that's a cold sun. And that mathematically, physically would mean that the sun has to be twice as far away as it is. I mean, there's just so much illogic here, right? So with spherical Earth, your solar input heating is 121 degrees Celsius. For them, it's minus 18 degrees Celsius. These are important differences, right? Don't you think it's relevant and scientifically valuable to consider what happens with the math between a spherical model and a flat Earth model? I mean, it's really cool, actually, right? I mean, if you care about just doing science. So if you use the spherical model, you should abide by heat flowing only from hot to cold, but theirs requires, heat flow from cold to hot. And of course, there are 4 cyclical circular arguments. So obviously this flat Earth model, no day and night. It's flat Earth, back radiation causes lapse rate, and there, whereas, in fact, the adiabatic effect causes lapse rate. And this is, peer-reviewed and pedagogical climate science. You learn this in university as introductory climate, and you and it's it's official literature sort of. But if you want to, as I did, as you guys know, just point out, why don't we do this on a spherical Earth? There's a few differences. Well, they call that crank science. I just want to point out, my next video is going to be about what we're facing in terms of what seems to be an enemy. So I just want to leave you with this here, with these incomprehensible responses that I've had from people, just to pointing out. So just look at what I'm doing here scientifically, right? As a scientist, as an astrophysicist, I'm just saying, look, you can use a spherical Earth, and if you use a spherical Earth, you get a better alignment in physics and in empirical reality. I mean, instead of saying that the solar input is equal to 1/4 of the solar input on flat lines, why not just use a sphere and use the real solar input? I mean, this is really basic stuff, right? It shouldn't be that big a deal. You would think that in the field of science, I should be able to find a simple meeting of the mind and be like, oh yeah, I see what you're doing there. Yeah, use a spherical Earth with real solar input instead of flat lines for the Earth and 1/4 solar input. Well, look at these strange responses. So in my next video, we're going to go more into this, but I just want to leave it with you. So this is from ED. So this is a person from my previous work. Eric Donovan was his name. And he said to me, after I showed him this and talked to him about this, he responded via email, Joe, you are dangerous and ill-informed. So I'm dangerous and ill-informed for saying that you can do an energy budget with a spherical Earth. Like, really, this is all I showed him. And I said, don't you think there's a better way? And he says, you are dangerous and ill-informed. So, of course, what is this? This is psychological projection, right? Who's dangerous, right? My policies aren't dangerous. Their policies are that they want to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and blot out the sun. So who's actually dangerous, right? So this is just pure psychological projection, right? That's what they're doing. They always blame you of what they themselves are doing. So then he says, words cannot communicate my disrespect for your position. So my position that, you can do an energy budget with a spherical Earth and apply adiabatic physics, which is, everyone knows how to do that once you've been through second year university thermodynamics. Anyone knows how to do that. It's not that difficult, right? You guys have seen the derivations. And so he cannot communicate the level of disrespect he has for me saying that the Earth is a sphere, and that maybe that's a better way of doing an energy budget than with flat lines. So of course, here I am, and I come nicely to these people, and I'm like, can we please just, scientifically talk about the difference this makes? And what's their response? Their response is no, and you're not allowed to work with us anymore. That was the result. They're like, no, you're not allowed to work with us anymore. If you're going to go around saying that the climate can be explained on a spherical Earth with a hot sunshine, you're not allowed to work with us anymore. That's literally what they did to me, right? What they did. You're not allowed to work with them anymore, right? So of course, we should in fact have complete contempt for their position, shouldn't we? For their position of deriving this climate scheme with a quarter solar input on a flat Earth, where they now, because of that, want to remove carbon dioxide and blot out the sun. We should in fact have complete contempt and hatred for their position, shouldn't we? So of course this is just inversion, isn't it, right? It's just a complete inversion is what these people do. We should be having such complete disrespect for them, right? Because that's what they deserve because of what their plans are and what they're doing, right? They're supposed to be scientists and they can't even talk about the difference between the mathematical difference between doing it with a flat line and quarter solar input versus a sphere, Earth, and the real solar input, right? So just bonkers, right? So this was this next one from Roy Spencer. As I was talking with him a few years ago, trying to communicate to him about this, and he says, no, the sunlight intercepted by the Earth does get spread over the full sphere of the Earth. That is basic geometry. And he went on, where this is sourced from, to say, how can postman not understand that? And it's like, what do you mean, how do I not understand that the sunlight intercepted by the Earth gets spread over the full sphere of the Earth? That does not happen, ever. And it's not an average state either. On average, and at any given time, there is a day and night, and only half of the Earth is being illuminated with the real-time solar input. This situation, where the whole Earth is experiencing 1/4 of the solar input completely uniformly over the entire surface, that never happens at any time, and it's completely invalid to even think of it that way, because you're saying that the solar input is equal to 1/4 of the solar input, right? So what is this? This is gaslighting, isn't it, right? We're being gaslighted, right? And look at this gem. This is from, I think the name was Scott Simmons. He's some scientist that I met on Facebook. And what a lovely response here. So he's referring to me. He says, Joe's theory fits every definition of a crank theory. It's obviously absurd, violates known laws of physics, and it's propped up by Postman's ego rather than evidence. So of course, what is this? It's just more psychological projection and gaslighting. Because if you simply consider what I'm saying, or what I'm simply pointing out, and people, I don't like to put this in terms of, oh, this is my theory, and my theory is better than other people's theories, like that would be crankish, right? I'm just pointing out what exists, and that it makes a difference. The Earth really truly is a sphere, and the solar input really is what it is, and I think that it makes a scientific difference between that and treating the Earth as a flat line with 1/4 solar input over the entire surface. That's not really crank territory, is it? Of course, they just have to project. Of course, this is crank theory, right? Saying that the sun is 1/4 of its own input. That's obviously crank. Using flat lines, that's obviously crank science, right? And the people who use that circular argument are obviously egotistically invested with protecting this greenhouse effect idea for some reason with their crazy circular argument. So of course it's just projection, right? It's just projection and gaslighting. So anyway, so as simple as that, despite them having, this cyclical, circular argument of 4 different ways of arguing for it, none, which are mutually inconsistent with each other. There's no consistent definition. So just get around all that and be like, okay, well, look, the final result of whatever scheme, however you want to argue that it exists and however you think it works by, it has an effect, doesn't it? It has an end result, which is supposed to be measurable, isn't it? And that's the creation of a temperature lapse rate. Okay, well, let's compare that with with the known physics of the adiabatic physics, the adiabatic lapse, right? And oh, look, that comes out to what's measured. When you work that out, it comes out to the measured value. So where is the room left over for your greenhouse effect to have a temperature modulating effect on the atmosphere? There's no room left for it, right? So it's debunked. So who cares about arguing, their circular argument and figuring out exactly how it works? Just look at its effect and then point out that that measured value of what the effect is supposed to be is already explained by the adiabatic lapse rate. And what that means then, therefore, is that this greenhouse effect doesn't exist and can't exist because it's not having the measured value that it is claimed to have, right? So, perfect. So please, could use your support for some of this work to continue this work. And my next video is going to be about discussing this apparent enemy that we're facing, that, they're saying these ridiculous comments to me, and they're saying that they really think it's a great idea that they should go ahead outside of government jurisdiction. They should go ahead with blotting out the sun. I mean, gosh, guys, right? It's a pretty bad situation. We're going to have to stop this from happening, right? Anyway, I've discussed this slide before. So if you want to continue, if you want me to continue with this effort, and this really is an effort. I should create a group for us, some sort of name, I don't know, Sovereign Earth Militia or Earth Vanguard, or I don't know, some name like that, because we are really going to be the people who stop this apparent enemy from wrecking the Earth. They apparently really want to wreck the Earth. They want to blot out the sun, remove carbon dioxide, and do all sorts of geoengineering to it, and they won't accept any simple demonstrations that they don't need to do all that, and their basic science is pretty flawed on that, So yeah, please support my work on this, that I can continue doing this. And yeah, here's my books. I'm sure most of you have seen this, but if you're new, here's my books. They're all fairly decent. I would say the first 3 books sort of outline the story arc for how I arrived to planet wars and identifying what it seems to be that we're facing here with this threat to planet Earth. It seems like these people really do have a plan to end life on Earth with removing carbon dioxide, blotting out the sun. And you can read that story arc and the conclusion. These next 2 books do use some elements from what I've discovered in this climate issue. But it's just sort of, debunking the simultaneity paradox, solving the double slit experiment. That's never been done before. I don't think that the simultaneity paradox has ever really been pointed out, really been dissected. It's so intellectually and rationally and logically toxic, actually, as I discuss in that book, to even start thinking down that sort of path puts your mind into such an illogical, cognitively dissonant state that it really prevents you from being able to think rationally. And I think that's what's happened to a lot of scientists. And then, what Einstein did with that simultaneity paradox, although he didn't support what happened in quantum mechanics and its crazy interpretations, it's the direct result. It definitely goes from the cognitive dissonance set up with his Einstein simultaneity paradox, and that goes directly into the cognitive dissonance of the metaphysical interpretations in quantum mechanics. And so by solving the simultaneity paradox and solving that logic and presenting it in a new, different way, it gives us a new way of looking at, some of the basic foundations of quantum mechanics, such as the double slit experiment, so that we can have a better metaphysical interpretation of how reality is functioning, and it's quite helpful. And it's all based on ontological mathematics. Illuminism, basically discussing, answering why there is something rather than nothing, based on the work of Mike Hockney and ontological mathematics, and this group, which apparently and seems to be a group of Pythagoreans. You might be familiar with the Pythagoreans, that they were they're called to be a cult, in the time of Pythagoras. They were a mathematical cult or a mathematical religion. They had their own academy and their own group, and they believed in the ontology of mathematics, that mathematics explains reality, and that's not at all an outlandish idea, because what do we do in modern physics? What has modern physics showed to us? That, reality is all about applying mathematics to understanding existence. So, having a cultish or religious position that mathematics provides us the true knowledge of existence. That's not that outlandish, but it's not just about physical existence as with the scientism people and the scientific materialists, right? You can actually go beyond and answer why there is something rather than nothing, and it really relates to your mind and even your soul and things like that, and it's really cool. So we discussed the basic theory of everything and how to understand why something exists rather than nothing. And then at the end of the book, there's some suggestions for lifestyle things you should do to take care of your personal health and your mental health and physical health. Okay, so hope that was useful for you guys. Just use that from now on. Forget about arguing about how their radiative agreement effect works. They have this stupid circular argument, and they'll just, you can argue that until they shut up, and then it'll be the next day, and they'll just start up over again, trying to do the whole circular argument switcheroo thing on you. So just forget that. Be like, okay, well, look, whatever your scheme is, it has an effect, doesn't it? It has an empirical observable, an effect on reality that should be there, and that effect is creating a temperature lapse rate. And just say, this adiabatic physics already explains that lapse rate. It already explains perfectly the rate of temperature decrease with altitude above the surface of the atmosphere, right? And so given that's the case, and whereas you are claiming that your radiative agreement effect should have a temperature lapse rate, the end result is that your radiative agreement effect cannot exist because the lapse rate is already explained, and there's no room for any further modulation from a radiative greenhouse effect. And then from there, obviously, that removes their justification for blotting out the sun and removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which would literally be the way to end all life on Earth. I mean, that's how you would do it. If you were to come up with a way to end all life on Earth, blotting out the sun and removing carbon dioxide would be the perfect way to do it. And so that's what it looks like they actually want to do. Because when you just try to point out to them, wait, if you do a climate energy budget with a spherical Earth versus a flat line Earth, you get rid of the greenhouse effect and there's no more climate alarmism and you don't need to blot out the sun anymore. And they get so mad and they're like, no, we're not going there. No, you're saying that the Earth is round, and then they'll, give you these ridiculous comments like I got from Eric Donovan from my old work. Cannot express my level of disrespect for your position. My position that you can do an energy budget with the Earth being a sphere and that makes a difference. That there's a difference between 121 degrees Celsius and minus 18 degrees Celsius. That's as if that's not a thing, Crazy, right? Okay, guys, nice chatting with you, and take care. Talk to you soon. I'll have a new video about the enemy we apparently face soon. Thanks, bye.